Nicolas Maduro announced last week that Venezuela is hosting a new round of Colombian peace talks. The talks began the very next day in Caracas. This dialogue is between the Colombian government and the insurgent National Liberation Army. Though there have been many leftist guerrilla groups in Colombia throughout 6 decades of ongoing civil war, the two biggest players were the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army and the National Liberation Army, aka the ELN. The government made a peace deal with the FARC in 2017 under the Juan Manuel Santos administration, even though Colombian voters narrowly rejected it in a referendum. However, that peace deal was only with the FARC. Tomorrow there will be a video on the Venezuela peace talks in Mexico, but the Colombia talks started first and are just as important. Now that a former M19 guerrilla, Gustavo Petro, is the president, the ELN was willing to come to the negotiating table after rejecting 4 invitations from previous administrations. One instant scandal in Colombia was the presence of Violeta Arango Ramirez at the dialogue table. This woman bombed a shopping mall in 2017, killing 3 women and injuring 12 other people. Violeta was charged for terrorism and on the run for years. During her time as a fugitive, she sent letters to newspapers claiming her innocence and denying any connection with the ELN. Meanwhile, she was being hidden and protected by different ELN units. She was arrested in 2020 and still denied having anything to do with the insurgency. Now, in November 2022, she appeared as part of the ELN delegation in Caracas. Violeta's presence means she was either given an executive pardon by Petro or some kind of special legal amnesty in order to be a delegate at the peace talks. Also, arrest warrants were suspended for the entire ELN delegation. So even if the dialogue breaks down and the guerrilla war continues in both countries, the Petro administration gave the entire insurgent delegation a get-out-of-jail-free card just for showing up. The ELN gets a big win right off the bat. These new Colombian peace talks have a lot of people in Colombia and Venezuela deeply concerned because the effects of the last peace agreement haven't been so great. Now that the ELN has come to negotiate, here's what we can expect. We can look for clues in other similar events with strong parallels to the current situation, starting with the most recent peace accords. In exchange for quitting the war in 2017, the FARC would become a political party and participate in the Colombian state. This party wasn't popular and didn't win enough votes for any seats in Congress. However, the peace agreement guaranteed the FARC 5 senators and 5 representatives in the lower house no matter what. Around 2/3 of FARC insurgents demobilized after the peace agreement, but there was a large faction that didn't agree to the peace accords, so they continued their war and drug trafficking operations. And why not? Hugo Chavez already gave the guerrillas safe haven in Venezuela, prolonging the Colombian war, and the guerrillas now control large chunks of the country and have even made it to Brazil and Guyana. Also, several FARC leaders who participated in the peace talks and who were on the list of the 10 guaranteed senators and congressmen reneged on the peace deal and went back to the bush. These include Ivan Marquez and Jesus Santrich, who announced from Venezuela their return to the war in August 2019, while other FARC party members took their place in Congress. Chavez had given the rebels a safe base because he wanted to see them come to power in Colombia. Maduro's regime let them spread out in Venezuela because he sincerely expected a US-led invasion, so the FARC and ELN became a buffer between him and the border. Meanwhile, the FARC is still a legalized political party in Colombia with seats in government. They changed their name, but their acronym is still FARC. They're a small party, but they're also part of the voting bloc of leftist parties with a supermajority in Congress. There's another major problem with the 2017 peace talks in Havana. While Raul Castro pretended Cuba was a neutral third party arbitrating the dialogue, the Cuban regime was always with the FARC. The Castro regime has trained FARC guerrillas and political cadres in Cuba since 1962, 2 years before the 6-decade war began. Fidel Castro literally helped start that war that still hasn't ended even as I record this. The Cuban regime also never stopped training the FARC. There's no way Cuban intelligence didn't know that several factions would reject the peace treaty and continue the war. In the ELN and FARC dissidents, they have a backup hammer to wield both in Colombia and Venezuela. Through Petro and the congressional majority, the Cubans now influence the Colombian state more than ever. So like Palpatine, they're playing both sides now. The FARC party supported Petro in the 2022 presidential election. He was smart and visibly distanced himself from them because he knew the optics could hurt him in the election. But really, Petro is cut from the same cloth as the ex-FARC combatants who turned into ballot box revolutionaries. Petro was a guerrilla with the M19 group who was captured in the 1980s, spent time in prison, lost faith in the armed struggle, and decided to seek power through the electoral process. The M19 guerrilla group demobilized in 1987 and became a political party in 1989. Petro met Fidel Castro in 1993, who took him under his wing, and the Cubans helped his political rise just as they were doing with Fidel's Venezuelan protege Hugo Chavez. By encouraging Petro to run for office, Castro was increasing Marxist political power in Colombia by using the rifle and the ballot box strategy to achieve the Cuban Communist Party's foreign policy goals. So fast forward to today, and the president of Colombia is a former guerrilla. The FARC is a legal political party and part of a congressional supermajority, and another part of the FARC is still fighting, still recruiting underage teenagers at gunpoint, still drug trafficking, and still controlling large chunks of Colombia and Venezuela. All of these events point to what we might see with the new round of peace talks. It's still possible that the peace talks break down, but if the guerrillas do agree to abandon the war, it's likely that more than half of the ELN will demobilize. That means a lot of Venezuelan men, women, and teenagers will be going home, since all Colombian armed groups now recruit Venezuelans. On the political front, the ELN will probably become a political party and start running candidates in elections. If they get the same guarantees that the FARC got, it would greatly help the socialists to have guaranteed seats in Congress in case they lose popularity and the opposition picks up momentum in future elections. It also wouldn't surprise me if Petro spearheaded an effort for Colombia to make a new socialist constitution so he can restart the clock on his presidency, just like Venezuela and Bolivia did, and soon Chile. Knowing the Cubans, there's always a trick up their sleeve. Even if the ELN agrees to end the war, I'm willing to bet that one or more factions will splinter from the ELN and continue fighting in both countries. I just don't see all the ELN bands leaving Venezuela. They control territory and are making money for the organization. They also present opportunities for Venezuelan generals. They could sacrifice a few ELN fighters to get promoted by giving Maduro a political victory so he can say on TV that his government fights terrorism. Or the local ELN commander could be a business partner for those generals engaged in the drug trade. These peace talks will also help Maduro a lot. After his term legally expired in 2019, 60 countries refused to recognize him. Sadly, Guaido's interim government didn't do a damn thing except embezzle money and then sell out for permanent cohabitation with the regime. But the US, the EU, and multiple other governments sanctioned Maduro. 3 years and some change later, sanctions on Russia over the war in Ukraine have a lot of governments now willing to make a deal with Maduro. Playing the role of diplomat and arbiter between a government and an insurgency that are both allies to his regime helps Maduro look like a leader again, like a man who gets important things done. And it gives these very tempted, oil-starved governments an excuse to forget for a little while that he's the leader of the Suns cartel and a wanted criminal. This also helps Petro, since a lot of Colombians are hungry for peace. Any peace agreement with the ELN is guaranteed to win votes for his party in the next municipal and regional elections. Plus, I've got a strong hunch there will be ELN dissidents still in the bush. In the end, Petro wins, the ELN wins, Maduro wins, and Havana wins. Colombians will get some peace in areas where guerrillas demobilize, at least until the next armed group comes to fill the vacuum. In areas where ELN dissidents continue their operations, civilians will lose. In Venezuela, hundreds of young Venezuelans will get a chance to start a new life, but they'll be doing it in one of the poorest countries in the world. Some of them don't even have families to go back to, and they're the ones most at risk of turning to crime or being recruited by other armed groups. Either way, with a huge propaganda victory helping to legitimize Maduro, plus the Vichy opposition handing Maduro another election, the Venezuelan people lose. And unfortunately, they'll suffer even more as long as there are ELN dissidents in Venezuela, and as long as Maduro is in power. Thank you for watching Venezuela Explained.